Hello, I'm Doris Peterson from the League of Women Voters of Palo Alto, and I'm here with Ellen Forbes to bring information to you about the upcoming election on November 2nd. Let's start with the election calendar. When is the deadline for registering to vote in this election?
To vote on Tuesday, November 2nd, you must be registered by Monday, October 18. The registration deadline is always 15 days before an election.
I hear that more and more people are voting by mail. If I'm voting by mail, when do I have to have my ballot in the mail to be sure my vote gets counted?
If you're not a permanent vote-by-mail voter, you have until October 26 to request a vote-by-mail ballot. Your ballot must be received by the Registrar of Voters by the time the polls close on Election Day. So you should probably mail your ballot several days in advance, say by the Friday before the election. However, you can also drop off your ballot at any polling place in your county on Election Day. If you send your ballot over with someone else, make sure you write that person's name in the space provided on the ballot envelope, or the poll workers won't be able to accept it.
So, what are we really going to be looking at on those ballots this time around? Various local measures will appear in front of voters, but today we will be concentrating on just the statewide propositions.
Yes, but before we get into the propositions, let's remind our audience where we come from and what we're trying to accomplish today. The League of Women Voters is actually two organizations, a nationwide member organization of women and men, and an education fund. Neither organization supports or opposes political parties or candidates, ever. But the member organization does take positions on public policy issues. Members vote to study an issue, they collect information and discuss it, and come to a consensus position. Then, when new laws are proposed, the League can compare those proposed laws with positions already established by the members and decide whether to support or oppose or remain neutral on them. The member organization may have taken positions on some of the propositions we will be discussing today. Although Doris and I are League members, we are not here to advocate on behalf of the League of Women Voters or to lend support to its positions. Instead, we are here as a service of the League of Women Voters Education Fund to give an unbiased explanation of the propositions, including the pros and the cons. Our purpose today is to inform voters, not to influence people to vote one way or the other. The wonderful and terrifying thing about initiative and referendum is that we, the voters, are directly responsible for some of the laws that shape the society we live in. What kind of a society do you want? If you make a serious effort to understand the likely effect of the measures you're voting on, your vote can reflect your principles. That's our passion here in the Education Fund element of the League of Women Voters. We want voters who are making conscious choices when they mark their ballots. Now, on to the measures themselves. What are we seeing this time around, Doris?
Proposition 20, Congressional Redistricting by Commission, and 27. Now that the legislature has withdrawn the water bonds, we have 9 left. Some are related, so rather than marching straight down the ballot, we're going to group them a bit. Proposition 20 and 27 are both constitutional amendments on redistricting, and they are competing propositions. Even if they both pass, only the one that gets the more votes will go into effect. Back in November 2008, the voters of California passed Proposition 11, which changed the way Assembly and State Senate districts are drawn. After every census, districts are redrawn to adjust for shifting populations. Before Proposition 11 passed, the legislature drew the new districts. Proposition 11 changed that, and redistricting from the 2010 census will be done by a 14-member Commission of Citizens. Commission members who have been screened for bias are randomly chosen by the state auditor's office from a pool of the most qualified candidates. People have had various responses to this change. Two of those responses appear on this ballot as Proposition 20 and 27. Proposition 20 extends the work of the Citizens Redistricting Commission set up by Proposition 11 by adding congressional districts to the Commission's responsibilities.
Why were congressional districts left off in the first place?
The congressional representatives were firmly against Proposition 11, and the backers decided to try to minimize their opposition by having their districts left unaffected.
Any other changes in Prop 20?
Under current law, the legislature needs to try to draw compact districts of nearly equal size and to keep neighborhoods and communities of interest together. Current law, though, doesn't say anything about neutrality. The legislature is not forbidden to consider the interests of parties or candidates. Proposition 20 places congressional districts under the same conditions as Proposition 11 put the state assembly and Senate districts. The Commission may not draw districts to favor candidates or parties. Who is for and against 20?
Signing arguments in favor, we have AARP, Common Cause, and the California Hispanic Chambers of Commerce. They say it will create fairer congressional districts. Money for Prop 20 is coming from physicist Charles Munger, Jr. Signing arguments against are the California Black Chamber of Commerce, a founding chairman of the Fair Political Practices Commission, and the Congress of California Seniors. They say that having the legislature do the job costs less and increases accountability. The money against comes from various elected officials' campaign funds.
What do you suppose brings the minority Chamber of Commerce in on opposing sides?
The key here is the emphasis on communities of interest. Both Propositions 20 and 27 and current law say that communities of interest should be kept together as much as possible so that neighborhoods aren't split up but can take their common concerns to a single representative. Proposition 20 goes farther, though, and defines a community of interest in the proposition. They describe it as a contiguous population which shares common social and economic interests that should be included within a single district for purposes of its effective and fair representation. Some people think that it works better when the Redistricting Commission defines community of interest for itself, and that too much attention on communities of interest can be detrimental. Proposition 27 is another one on redistricting, isn't it?
Yes, Proposition 27 reverses Proposition 11, returning redistricting authority to the legislature. It also tightens the requirement for same-size districts. Currently, districts are supposed to be reasonably equal in population, and this is the highest priority requirement in drawing districts. They can, however, differ somewhat in size in order to meet other criteria. Proposition 27 would put stricter size constraints in place. Under Proposition 27, district populations would need to differ by no more than one person. Proposition 27 also removes some of the rules introduced by Proposition 11. If 27 passes, districts will no longer have to be drawn so as not to favor candidates or parties, and they won't need to be geographically compact or nested, where one state Senate district contains exactly 2 state assembly districts. How are the arguments looking for 27, Ellen?
Supporters say that Prop 27 will save money and increase accountability. Among Proposition 27 supporters, we find the Congress of California Seniors, a founding member of the Fair Political Practices Commission, and Californians Against Waste. Money is coming from various incumbents' political campaign funds. Opponents say that Proposition 27 removes power from voters and allows politicians to draw districts that guarantee job security for themselves. Opposing 27 are AARP, the League of Women Voters, and California Common Cause, with funding coming from Charles Munger, Jr.
Wow, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Next, we have two propositions, 25 and 26, on the ballot that deal with state government finances and how changes are approved. Both are constitutional amendments. Proposition 25 is on the spending side, and Proposition 26 is on the revenue side of the ledger. In California, many things can be decided by majority vote, but years ago, voters set aside some things needing a 2/3 vote to enact. This makes it much harder to get some things passed, an effect that can be seen as either beneficial or detrimental. An advantage is that anything passed by a 2/3 vote has very strong support, and you avoid having 51% of the voters disregarding the will of the minority. On the other hand, though, a 2/3 vote requirement can result almost in the tyranny of the minority. Say, if about 65% of the voters want things one way and the other 35% keep on getting their will instead. Proposition 25 and 26 are attempts to change the things that need a 2/3 vote. Proposition 25 is on the spending side, while Proposition 26 is on the revenue side.
How would Proposition 25 change things?
Let's start with a little bit of background. The Constitution requires a 2/3 vote in the legislature for 1. Bills that need to take effect immediately, 2. Bills that allocate general fund money, and 3. Bills that raise state revenue. The state budget allocates general fund money and needs to take effect immediately, so that qualifies on 2 accounts. There are also bills that are passed along with the budget to implement spending decisions. For instance, if responsibility for something moves from one department to another, and those budget-related bills also need a 2/3 vote. California is only one of 3 states that requires more than a majority vote to pass a budget, and its budget has been passed by the June 15th deadline only 4 years out of the past 30. Proposition 25 would change the Constitution so that the budget and related bills could be passed with a simple majority. It does not change the section of the Constitution dealing with revenue or tax increases at all. One last provision. Proposition 25 changes the law further so that legislators may not collect, pay, or expenses when the budget is late. Currently, legislators' pay is stopped when the budget is late, but back pay accumulates and paid when they finally do pass the budget. However, under Proposition 25, they will not have any right to be paid for extra time spent on the budget.
So that one takes something that currently requires a supermajority and changes it to a simple majority. Unions, consumer groups, and the League of Women Voters are signing arguments in favor of 25. They say that late budgets waste tax money and inflate costs. Funding is coming primarily from unions. In opposition, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association and some business groups say that Prop 25 will make it easier to raise taxes. Funding against is coming from the Chamber of Commerce and energy and beverage companies. What about Proposition 26?
Proposition 26 is on the revenue side of the state finance. Currently, it takes a 2/3 vote of the legislature to raise taxes, but only a majority vote to raise fees. Proposition 26 broadens the definition of tax so that some fees that are spent for the benefit of a large population, not just the fee-paying group, will require a 2/3 vote to raise or create. Fees that are spent for the benefit of the fee payer will continue to need a simple majority. The classic example of the type of fee affected by 26 is the regulatory fee paid by companies that make products containing lead, for example. The money is spent to combat lead poisoning in children, so the benefits the public in general rather than the business paying the fee. The California Supreme Court has ruled that this is nevertheless a fee rather than a tax under current law. Energy companies and makers of alcoholic beverages pay similar fees that are used to mitigate possible harm done by their products. If Proposition 26 passes, fees of this type would need a 2/3 vote to enact. Proposition 26 also changes the definition of raising state revenues. Currently, if a proposed law has no net effect on state revenues, it can be passed by a majority vote of the legislature. Under the terms of Proposition 26, if even one taxpayer will pay more as a result of the proposed law, even if the total revenue coming into the state will be the same or lower, it needs a 2/3 majority to pass. As a result, any change in where the tax burden falls would only be able to be adopted by a 2/3 vote. Proposition 26, if it passes, takes effect retroactively, so any regulatory fees passed or shifts in tax burden made since the beginning of 2010 would be nullified unless they were passed again, this time with a 2/3 majority. One likely consequence of this will be to shift about $1.3 billion annually from the general fund back to the transportation funds by nullifying a recent fuel tax change that allowed the money to be used more flexibly. Who is supporting and opposing 26?
In favor of 26, we have the California Taxpayers Association, the California Chamber of Commerce, and the Small Business Action Committee, among others. Funding is coming from the Chamber of Commerce and energy and beverage companies. They say that fees are just taxes by another name, and they should be hard to pass. Opposing 26 are environmental groups, the League of Women Voters of California, and the California Association of Professional Scientists. Funding is primarily coming from unions. They say that regulatory fees are spent to mitigate harm done by some businesses, and it's right that these businesses should pay fees to clean up their messes. Next comes Proposition 19, the legalization of marijuana. We are hearing a lot about that one.
Yes, if Proposition 19 passes, possession and cultivation of marijuana for personal use would 1. Become legal for individuals age 21 or older under state law, though illegal under federal law, and 2. Authorize various commercial marijuana-related activities under certain conditions. Local governments would be empowered to regulate aspects of the production, transportation, and sale of marijuana, and the state or local government could impose marijuana-related fees and taxes. Laws forbidding supplying marijuana to minors or possessing it on school grounds remain unchanged. This is a proposition that will likely have significant fiscal effects. The legislative analyst acknowledges great uncertainty in the numbers, but suggests law enforcement savings might be in the tens of millions of dollars annually, while increased annual revenue from taxes and fees might be in the hundreds of millions. What do the arguments look like here, Ellen?
Most of the people signing arguments on both sides are in law enforcement. In favor, we hear the argument that prohibition has failed and it's time to try regulation. Against, we see the argument that this proposition opens things up way too wide, particularly in the areas of drugs in the workplace and driving under the influence. What's next?
Proposition 21 proposes an $18 annual surcharges on vehicle registration fees, the money to be used to support state parks and wildlife programs. In exchange for the surcharge, California vehicles would get a free admission to the parks. Visitors would still pay fees for camping or other extra services. The measure would bring in about $500 million annually. The most likely result is that the general fund spending on parks would be reduced then by about $200 million, leaving the parks with a net increase in revenue of $250 million after accounting for the free entry. The general fund would then be able to use that $200 million for other purposes. What are people saying about this one?
The taxpayers' associations are not in favor, of course, seeing 21 as a tax increase, which it is. Parks foundations and environmental groups, on the other hand, contend it is a responsible solution to the chronic underfunding of parks. What does Proposition 22 hold for us?
Proposition 22 is another constitutional amendment. It is a response to the many contortions the state has gone through in trying to balance recent budgets. They've generally reached for any money they could in the short term, promising to pay it back later. In early 2010, the state shifted the burden of fuel taxes to raise the excise tax on gasoline, but not charge any sales tax. This doesn't change the total amount of money coming into the state, but it does give the state more flexibility in spending the money. The fuel companies dislike the change enough that they are supporting both Proposition 22 and 26 because if either one passes, the fuel tax will be undone. Proposition 22 would block the state government from 1. Borrowing or reallocating fuel tax funds, redevelopment funds and property taxes, and 2. From using more vehicle license fee money to reimburse local governments, or 3. Fuel taxes to pay transportation bond costs. This would result in approximately $1.3 billion a year of increased pressure on the general fund, mainly from paying back transportation bonds, and approximately $1.3 billion a year more being available for transportation and local governments. I can imagine what the argument for this one looks like.
Yes, as expected, the proponents, cities and local public safety officials, want local government budgets to be under less strain. They also feel that transportation issues have taken a back seat for too long. The opponents, teachers and statewide public safety officials, feel the general fund is in such crisis that this loss of flexibility will have dire results for the social services paid for from the general fund. They also say that redevelopment agencies should not be favored over social services. What do we see in Proposition 23?
If Proposition 23 passes, Assembly Bill 32, the California Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006, will be suspended until unemployment drops below 5.5% for a year, a condition that has occurred only 3 periods in the last 40 years. Not all of California's air pollution laws are under the AB 32 umbrella, but it is a significant part of California's greenhouse gas reduction and air quality improvement programs. Suspension of AB 32 would likely suspend the program known as cap and trade, in which major emitters of greenhouse gas emissions can buy, sell, or trade emission allowances. Suspension would also affect California's low carbon fuel standard and the requirement for utilities to obtain at least 30% of their energy from renewable sources by 2020. The legislative analyst notes that economic effect of Proposition 23 is very unpredictable. There will be economic benefits from lower energy and regulation costs and economic costs from reduced activity in green tech and higher healthcare costs. Who's weighing in on Proposition 23?
Money and support is coming from the oil and gas companies, about $8 million so far, while green tech companies and environmental groups have put up about $13 million in opposition. Those in favor of 23 argue that the economy is currently weak and shouldn't be burdened by these regulations, while those against argue that progress toward cleaner energy is too important to back off from. One proposition left. What does 24 look like?
Proposition 24 repeals legislation passed in 2008 and 2009 that allows businesses to lower their tax liability. Proposition 24 returns the tax law to the way it was before. There are 3 parts. Right now, a company that loses money in 1 year can use the loss to reduce taxes in following years, but it can't go back and use the loss to offset taxes already paid. A 2008 change in the law made it so that starting in 2011, those carrybacks would become legal. If Proposition 24 passes, things will stay the way they are instead. Companies still won't be able to use current losses to offset taxes they've already paid. The second area is in taxes paid by multi-state companies. Right now, there is a formula that uses payroll, property, and sales to determine what share of business income is taxed by the state. A 2009 change in the law will allow companies to choose either that formula or one based just on sales to determine what part of their income will be subject to California tax. If Proposition 24 passes, that change won't happen either, and companies will continue to use the three-part formula. Finally, there is the topic of tax credits. Under a law passed in 2008, a business can share tax credits within a group of related businesses. Under the terms of Proposition 24, in future years, tax credits will need to stay with the business entity that received them. If Proposition 24 passes, state revenues are estimated to be about $1.3 billion higher annually than if it does not pass. Who is for and against Proposition 24?
Backing 24, we see the California Tax Reform Association, the League of Women Voters of California, and the California Teachers Association, with funding coming from the Teachers Association. They ask, why put loopholes in the tax laws? Against, we have the California Taxpayers Association, the California Small Business Alliance, and a former State Secretary of Education. With funding from California-based multi-state corporations, such as Fox News and Cisco, they say we shouldn't raise taxes in a weak economy.
Well, if that's all the propositions, is there anything else you want to make sure people know about?
Yes, we'd like you to know that the League of Women Voters has speakers like us available before every statewide election. We make presentations on ballot measures throughout the community, at libraries, churches, all kinds of community groups. If you would like to schedule a presentation for your group, go to the League of Women Voters of California website at ca.lwv.org. That's ca.lwv.org, and click on Find a Local League on the left-hand side. Your local League of Women Voters will be happy to arrange for a speaker for your group. We will be continuing to make presentations up to Election Day, November 2.
I'd also like to remind viewers about the League of Women Voters nonpartisan election information website. Voters can learn about everything on their ballot by visiting www.smartvoter.org and typing in their address. They can even find their polling place. One other good place is to look for election materials, the Easy Voter Guide, found in libraries and community centers and at www.easyvoter.org. The Easy Voter Guide is printed in 5 languages, and all of them are available to download. If you really want to dig into the propositions, look on Smart Voter for links to more information. The Secretary of State's website at www.sos.ca.gov has all kinds of useful information, including the records of who is giving how much money to which propositions. Sometimes the supporters and opponents of records are not the people pouring money into the campaign. So that part of the site, which is called Cal Access, can make for very entertaining reading. And finally, your local Registrar of Voters site has everything you ever wanted to know about local measures and voting in your area. But however you decide, please look at your voting choices, spend a little time understanding them, and then vote your principles, because we voters are the ones who create the society we live in, and it's a job worth doing well. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to the Media Center for making this program possible.